On January 30th, 2026, Buckingham Palace released a quiet statement. It was short, it was carefully worded, and to most people scrolling through their phones that evening, it looked like nothing. But insiders didn't see nothing. Within hours, royal watchers across the country were repeating the same question. Why was a private Scottish property suddenly connected to Lady Louise Windsor? And why did the palace say so little about something that clearly meant so much? That question is where this story begins. Not with the property, not with the legal documents, but with the silence. Because in royal circles, silence is never empty. Silence is a message. And this particular silence was louder than anything the palace had said in years. To understand what happened on January 30th, you have to understand something about Lady Louise Windsor that most people overlook. She is not a background figure. She is not simply Edward and Sophie's daughter who smiled at the right moments and stayed out of the headlines. Louise is, by every account from people who have spent time near the royal family, one of the most quietly strategic young people in that institution. She watched, she learned, she chose, very deliberately, to reject a title that was offered to her. Think about that for a moment. She was offered a dukedom, a formal royal title, a seat at the table that most people in that family would have taken without a second thought, and she said no. That decision told the world something important. It told the world that Lady Louise Windsor was not interested in the performance of royalty. She was interested in the substance of it. And there is a very big difference between those two things. The performance is the title, the procession, the photograph, the wave from the balcony. The substance is what happens behind closed doors. Who holds what, who controls what, and who decides what the next generation of this family will remember. That is the world Louise chose to inhabit, quietly, deliberately, without fanfare. So when a Scottish estate connected to her name surfaced in January 2026, the people who understood Louise, truly understood her, were not entirely surprised. They were, however, watching very carefully. Because this was not just a property transfer, this was a signal. And signals from the royal family always carry more information than they appear to. Let's talk about what was actually confirmed. A private Scottish estate, described in reports as remote, historically significant, and long kept off the main radar of royal property discussions, was connected to Lady Louise in official documentation. The palace did not provide a detailed explanation. They rarely do for private matters of this kind. What sources described, and this is reported, not independently verified, was that the property had been in discussions for some time before the January announcement. Not days, months, possibly longer. That timeline matters enormously because it means whatever decision was made, it was not impulsive, it was planned. And planned decisions in the royal family involve conversations at the highest levels. Now here is where the story deepens. People started calling it the Grey House. Nobody could say with certainty whether that was a formal name, a local name, or simply a description that circulated in whispered conversations. But the name stuck. And names stick for a reason. The Grey House. There is something in those two words that captures exactly what this property represented. Not brightness, not spectacle, not the gold-trimmed grandeur of the palaces most people associate with the royal family. Gray, understated, unmapped, the kind of place where things can be kept that were never meant to be found easily. And that is the piece that changed the temperature of this story. Because according to multiple sources with differing levels of proximity to the palace, so weigh this accordingly, the Grey House was not significant primarily because of its land or its architecture. It was significant because of what was inside it. Letters, private correspondence, records of conversations, decisions, and relationships that never made their way into the official royal archives. Documents that existed in the space between history and privacy. This is what insiders were really discussing when they heard Louise's name attached to this estate. Not the square footage, not the views of the Highlands, the rooms, and what was in them. Now let's be honest about what we know and what we don't. What is confirmed? The estate exists, the transfer happened, and Louise's name is part of the official documentation. What is reported but not independently verified? the contents of the property, the private significance of the records it may hold, and the internal discussions that preceded the transfer. What remains rumored, the specific nature of any conflict that arose around this decision, and the level of involvement of other senior royals. Those three categories, confirmed, reported, rumored, are the framework that keeps this story honest. And that honesty matters because in royal coverage, the line between fact and narrative is crossed constantly, quietly, and without apology. But here is what insiders discovered next that made the situation even more sensitive. The transfer and the decision behind it had not gone unnoticed by everyone in the family. Sources began circulating that Camilla's camp, and when we say camp, we mean the advisors, the aides, the people whose job it is to monitor institutional narratives, had been watching this situation closely for some time. Not aggressively, not openly, but watching. Because Camilla, whatever one thinks of her place in this family, understands one thing with crystalline clarity: in the royal institution, whoever controls the private record controls the story. And the story is everything. To understand Camilla's position, you have to understand the role she has spent the last decade building. She did not arrive at Buckingham Palace as a beloved figure. She arrived as a complicated one. She spent years navigating public skepticism, institutional resistance, and the shadow of a woman, Diana, whose memory has never diminished in the public imagination. What Camilla built through patience and positioning was something more durable than popularity. She built institutional power. She became, over time, not just Charles's wife, but a figure whose influence over the palace's internal culture was genuine and substantial. That kind of power does not let go of the levers easily. So when a property connected to private historical records moved into the hands of a young royal who had already demonstrated a preference for operating outside the traditional power structures, a young royal who rejected titles, who chose substance over performance, who was close to her father but not defined by him. The calculation for Camilla's camp was not emotional, it was strategic. Louise holding that property did not just mean Louise held land, it meant Louise held narrative. And narrative, in this family, is the most dangerous thing you can hold. But the real reason this story escalated was hidden in the legal language. And here is where we have to slow down, because the legal angle is where most coverage loses people by drowning them in terminology. Let's make it simple. When a property is transferred, especially a private one with historical significance, the terms of that transfer define what can and cannot happen to it afterward, who can access it, who can modify what is stored there, who has authority over decisions made in relation to its contents. These are not minor administrative details, these are the walls of the castle. And according to sources with knowledge of the documentation, again reported, not independently confirmed, the transfer to Louise included language that drew very specific lines. Lines that essentially said, certain parties, regardless of their institutional position, do not have automatic access or control here. That kind of clause in a document connected to the royal family is not standard language. Standard transfers don't need to say who cannot be involved. They describe what the property is and who now holds it. When you add exclusion language, when you write not just who has rights but who does not, you are writing the transfer in response to a specific concern. You are saying in legal terms what a conversation in a room would say in plain ones: this is not yours, this never was. And this document makes that permanent. Now let's look at the family chessboard that surrounded this moment, because no decision in the royal family exists in isolation. Every move creates a ripple, and every ripple touches a different shore. Start with Charles. His position in all of this is not simple. He is Louise's uncle. He is Camilla's husband. He is the king. Those three roles pull in three different directions, and anyone who has followed Charles across the decades of his royal life knows that he does not handle competing loyalties with ease. He is a man of deep feeling and deep tradition, which sounds like a strength until those two things point toward opposite decisions. In this situation, the tradition, protecting the integrity of private family records, ensuring that sensitive documentation stays in careful hands, aligned with Louise. The feeling, his relationship with Camilla, his desire to manage internal conflict carefully, aligned with something more complicated. What Charles did or said internally around this transfer, we do not know. What we know is that the transfer happened, which tells us something about where the weight of this decision ultimately fell. Then there is Sophie, Edward's wife, Louise's mother, a woman who has, over many years of royal life, developed a reputation for something rarer than charm in that institution: genuine steadiness. Sophie does not make headlines by accident. She moves carefully, speaks carefully, and protects carefully. Her relationship with Louise has always appeared to be one of the more authentic bonds in the modern royal family. Not performative closeness for cameras, but actual, grounded, daily presence. Sources have described Sophie as not just supportive of Louise's choices, including the decision to reject a title, but as an architect of the environment in which Louise felt safe enough to make them. If Louise had a guardian in this story, Sophie was it. Quietly, without a press release, which is entirely Sophie's way. Edward, for his part, exists in this narrative as a man whose own relationship with institutional power has always been slightly at an angle. He never fully inhabited the role that was assumed for younger royal sons. He pursued his own path in television production, which was considered unconventional. He came into his dukedom quietly, without the drama that has surrounded other royal inheritances. He and Sophie built something in their corner of the family that looked, to those watching, like something the institution rarely produces: a functional, private, genuinely contented unit. The Grey House transfer, in that light, was not just a legal event. It was the continuation of a long, quiet project, securing something real for their daughter in a family where the line between real and performed can be very difficult to find. Anne sits at the edge of this picture in a way that is worth acknowledging. She is the family's steel spine. She has always operated by a code that prioritizes duty, discretion, and the kind of directness that makes some people uncomfortable and others deeply respectful. Anne does not do sentiment in public. She does do loyalty, and her loyalty, historically, tends toward those who take the institution seriously rather than those who perform it. Louise, in her decisions, aligns more closely with Anne's model of royalty than with almost any other member of the younger generation. That alignment is not irrelevant. In a family where alliances are rarely stated openly, it is precisely these kinds of quiet alignments that tell you where the real architecture of support lies. Now let's talk about the moment that shifted public perception. Because it was not a legal document. Legal documents rarely do that. It was something smaller, more human, more symbolic. And in the royal family, symbolic is never small. It was a photograph and a brooch and a choice of words in a public appearance. Louise appeared, understated as always, wearing a piece of jewelry that connected, historically, to the private side of the family story. Not a state jewel, not a gift for cameras, something older, more personal, and deeply recognizable to those who understood the family's internal language of objects. In royal communication, what you wear tells people what you want them to know without you having to say it. And what this particular appearance said, to those who could read it, was this: I am aware of what I hold, I am aware of what it means, and I have chosen to be clear about it. Combined with her choice of words, careful, minimal, containing none of the hedging that royal figures often use when navigating sensitive institutional territory, the message was complete. This was not an accident. This was a young woman who had watched this family for 27 years, who had turned down titles and press exposure and the conventional path of royal engagement, stepping into a very specific kind of visibility. Not the visibility of spectacle, the visibility of position. She was saying, without saying, I am here, I know what this means, and I am not moving. That moment created a public perception split that is still developing. On one side, there are those who see Louise as exactly what the monarchy needs: young, principled, uncontaminated by the performative excesses of the institution at its worst, and in possession of something real rather than just symbolic. They look at her choices and see someone who might, in time, represent the monarchy's best argument for its own continued relevance. On the other side, there are those who see the situation more skeptically, who ask whether the quiet transfer of historically significant documents to a private individual, even a thoughtful, principled one, is the right way to handle materials that arguably belong to a broader national story. Whether Louise's intentions are good is not the question for these observers. The question is whether private custody, however carefully structured, is an adequate substitute for transparent institutional oversight. Both of those positions are serious. Neither of them is going away. Because here is what this story is ultimately about. It is not about a house in Scotland. It is not about one young woman's inheritance. It is about something that the monarchy has been grappling with in various forms for decades. The question of who controls the narrative of the royal family, and whether that control should rest with the institution, with specific individuals within it, or with some framework that is more accountable to the public, whose imagination and goodwill the monarchy depends on to exist. The people who built the clause in that transfer document understood this question. They were not naive about it. They were answering it in their preferred direction. Their answer was Louise. Their answer was private custody carefully defined with clear exclusions. Their answer was, we trust this person more than we trust the institutional machinery that surrounds her. That is a significant statement. It is a statement about where this family's confidence currently resides and where it does not. And what does Camilla do with that? This is where the story moves into its final, most interesting phase. Because the move has been made. The document is signed. The clause is in place. The question now is not whether the transfer happened, it did, but what it means for the balance of power inside the institution going forward. Camilla is not a woman who responds to setbacks by retreating. She is a woman who responds by repositioning. The mechanism by which she will attempt to influence this story, whether through advisors, through public narrative, through the careful management of Charles's perspective, or through something else entirely, is not yet visible. But it will become visible. These things always do. And Louise? Louise will do what Louise has always done. She will stay quiet. She will stay out of the unnecessary exposure. She will make choices that look small on the outside and carry enormous weight on the inside. She will hold what she holds, and she will wait, because she understands, perhaps better than anyone else in her generation of this family, that in the long game of royal life, patience is not passive. It is the most active strategy available. So where does this go? There are two possible outcomes, and they are genuinely different in their implications. The first possibility, the Grey House stays quiet. Louise manages the property with discretion. Whatever is inside remains inside. The transfer becomes, over time, simply a footnote in the legal history of the family. Significant to those who are watching, invisible to everyone else. Life in the palace continues. Tensions settle into their new configuration, and the story fades from royal coverage within 6 to 12 months. That is possible. That has happened before with matters of similar initial intensity. The second possibility, the contents of the Grey House become relevant. Not because Louise chooses to make them so, she almost certainly won't, but because the world around her changes in a way that makes the question of what she holds unavoidable. A biography, a documentary, a court proceeding. A political moment that forces the question of what the royal family's private history actually contains. In that scenario, Louise is not just a quiet young woman who rejected a title and held some land in Scotland. She is the person who controls a piece of the story that someone else desperately needs, or desperately needs to suppress. And in that scenario, the clause in that transfer document stops being a legal technicality and becomes the most important sentence in a very long and complicated family history. Which outcome happens? We genuinely don't know, and that uncertainty is not a weakness in this story, it is the story. The royal family has always existed at the intersection of the personal and the institutional, the private and the public, the human and the symbolic. Lady Louise Windsor in this moment sits at the center of all of those intersections. Not because she sought the spotlight, but because the choices she has made carefully, quietly over many years put her exactly there. Here is what we know for certain. Buckingham Palace does not make quiet moves for quiet reasons. A statement released on January 30th, 2026, that most people ignored, contained within it a shift in the distribution of something more valuable than property. Something that the most powerful figures in this institution understand better than almost any external observer: the power to decide which version of this family story gets told. Lady Louise Windsor now holds a piece of that power. How she uses it, or whether she uses it at all, will be one of the more fascinating threads to follow in the years ahead. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Do you believe that Louise holding this property, and the records it may contain, is the right outcome? Is private custody with careful legal protections the best way to handle materials connected to one of the world's most scrutinized families? Or does this transfer, however thoughtfully constructed, represent a consolidation of narrative control that ultimately serves the family more than it serves the public whose story the monarchy is supposed to share? Leave your answer in the comments, because the answer to that question tells you something not just about the Grey House. It tells you something about what you believe the monarchy is actually for. And that is the conversation worth having.